Hi everyone, welcome back to this YouTube series, How to Delete the Ego, How to Dissolve the Ego, however you want to say it. This is part 2 of this YouTube series, this course that I've created, free course that you have access to. This is about trauma. This is what we're going to be covering in this video. So in the last video was the introduction video. We talked about what the ego is. We talked about how we're going to be covering the second ego here, right? The second ego being that constant egoic mind that keeps coming in and keep creating blocks in your life, right? Some kind of fear, some kind of survival that it believes that you are in. So it creates the blocks and the barriers. We talked about how the ego can be seen as a protective mechanism. It acts as some kind of protective mechanism. You got to see the ego as basically some kind of an overprotective parent. Think about an overprotective parent. What do? They really believe they love you, of course. They really believe that they're doing everything right for you, right? And they just carry on in that way because they believe that's their role. But what they don't understand is actually what love truly is. And this is actually how, and if you go further along this course, you'll see how you can start deleting the ego, because it's training them in that way, training the ego in that way to understand that. So the ego, in a way, acts like an overprotective parent. It believes that it's doing the right thing. It's wanting to be there for you. It's trying to protect you, but it doesn't quite understand that maybe it's not needed as many times as it believes that it's needed, right? Okay, so if I'm looking down, I'm just looking at the notes and making sure that I'm covering everything. In this video, like I said, we're going to talk about trauma. Trauma is how the ego is formed. This is how the ego is formed. Now, ego is there from the beginning. You are born with ego, right? Because, like I said, ego number one is the survival mechanism that you need, and that biological part of you that comes in and it stays there. It doesn't go away. So that's cool. We've got nothing to worry about. You can relax. You're always going to be protected because you've got that ego, right? But the second part of the ego gets formed when trauma happens in your life. Now, the question is identifying trauma in your life. And I wonder, before we kind of go into identifying the trauma, kind of talking about the trauma, do you even know if you've experienced trauma in your life? Do you know whether you've experienced certain events in your life that you would consider some kind of trauma, right? Start with that, because now we're going to cover what trauma actually is, because we have, in this matrix system, we've been conditioned to believe that trauma must be abuse, right? If you have been abused, then you have experienced trauma. That is not true. Trauma is how your body perceives trauma to be. If your body feels it through that lens, and it believes it through that lens, and therefore it goes through all the bodily sensations and the bodily experiences that is trauma going through your body, then you have experienced some kind of trauma, right? It's more like that than what you believe that you've been told that is trauma. So, trauma happens, so there's traumatic responses that happen through your body in these fear and survival moments that maybe you've gone through. So some kind of trauma body that you might experience is disassociation, disconnection to yourself, and then that can come out in unconscious behaviors such as overthinking, shouting, overanalyzing, not wanting to face something. So many different ways. There's a shaking. Sometimes you might feel shaky. Different body temperatures you might go through in different kinds of ways, right? So when trauma comes in, these could be some of the ways that your body responds to trauma. So like I said before, the ego gets formed when trauma comes in because the ego believes that it's needed, right? Because remember, the ego only knows fear and survival. And then when the trauma happens, then your body goes into this, what I call is the trauma body. The trauma body as all these unconscious types of behaviors that happen. So again, disconnection, disassociation, shaky feeling maybe, unconscious behaviors such as shouting, overthinking, and so on. So in terms of that, I want you to ask yourself this question. How do you feel after your body goes through any kind of traumatic event. How have you felt after your body has gone through some kind of traumatic event that you have perceived to be some kind of, life experience, traumatic event in your life? How have you felt? How does your body feel? Can you connect to your body to even understand how your body feels? And what have you noticed about these bodily sensations within you? It's important that you understand how trauma works in terms of what that is for you. If you are affected by something, let's put it in a different way. If you are affected by something, and you feel it within your body, you know there's something not right, that you don't feel right, you maybe feel ungrounded, whatever it is. If you are affected by something, then basically you have experienced some kind of trauma. If you can start seeing it in that way, that might help. Another way of seeing trauma is this: what you are triggered by, you are going to react to from that kind of a traumatic experience. So what you're triggered by is a pattern that's been created from this trauma, and you're going to go through these triggers and you're going to be affected by the triggers. Those triggers are basically representing some kind of trauma in your life. That's another way of saying it. So if you're being triggered by something, it's some kind of trauma, some kind of life experience that's affected you enough for you to be triggered by that. That's another way of seeing trauma. So trauma can be so many things, like we said, right? Yes, of course, it can be abuse. It could be physical abuse, it can be verbal abuse, and so on, right? Trauma can also occur, of course, in childhood, but it can also happen in adulthood. So when you're an adult, when you're older, you can actually go through traumatic events and be affected by that as well. But trauma can also be, like I said, the things that maybe you don't think are traumatic, but actually you have been really affected by. So think about being a middle child, if anyone watching this has been a middle child. So not always, but sometimes middle children can feel a bit left out, feel annoyed by things because they don't maybe feel heard, they don't feel understood, let's say, okay. So think about this example of being a middle child. You feel unheard growing up, you didn't feel like your parents understood you, you felt alone, you felt like, maybe there was betrayal there, and so on, right? What happens, let's say in that example, is as you grow up, those patterns get created from that traumatic event. So let's see it as in that traumatic event as a middle child growing up. So many times you didn't feel heard, you didn't feel seen or understood by your parents. And you could see your siblings in a different way. Maybe you felt like they were given attention, they were understood, they had all the fancy stuff and you didn't, or whatever, right? But growing up, you felt unheard, unseen, and misunderstood, right? So what happens then in these traumatic experiences when you're younger, a pattern within you, within your energetic body gets created, and then that pattern carries on as you grow older until it gets deleted, which is what, we're doing now in this awakening as we're becoming more conscious of our patterns, right? So we can start deleting that. So as you're growing up, this pattern keeps on repeating, this pattern of believing maybe you're unworthy because you weren't seen when you were younger. So that keeps on getting created. And then what happens then is that you start seeing that in your life, possibly and usually through some kind of relationship. So think about a relationship with your partner, right? So now you're older, as this middle child, you're now older in this pattern and you're in a relationship with someone, and so many times you're feeling triggered by how you're believing that your partner doesn't quite hear you, doesn't quite understand you, can't really hear what you're saying. And maybe you feel annoyed by that, maybe you feel angry. These are the unconscious behaviors that come out. So the pattern is you're feeling unworthy, you're feeling like you believe you're not lovable. That's the pattern. And the triggers come in, oh my gosh, the shouting comes in, I must be unlovable. Maybe, you're obviously not aware of that, or maybe you are. And then the unconscious behaviors come in. This is the trauma body now speaking in some kind of shouting. Maybe you're more demanding than usual, right? Maybe you're overthinking things again. That is the trauma body speaking. That is how the trauma happens. And that is how the ego works in terms of trauma. So the ego has come in when you were a child, let's say as this middle child, and the ego has come in to keep protecting you and keep you in this old pattern. Remember, the ego only knows fear and survival. So when this old pattern continues in your life, the ego has to be there because it believes you are in fear and survival. Because what happened when you were a child? You were in fear and survival. That's when the trauma happened. So it continues. The ego is there with you every single time, keeping you in fear and survival because it believes you are in fear and survival. And then what happens, like I said, is the trauma body comes out. These are your unconscious behaviors. And now you're shouting, screaming, maybe not wanting to face something, whatever it is. So now I want you to ask yourself this question. What traumas and life events have I experienced that brings out unconscious behaviors? I'll say that again. What traumas and life events have I experienced that brings out unconscious behaviors? And also, what are my patterns? Think about what we just talked about. We were talking about how trauma happens, how the ego comes in when trauma happens, and how these patterns get created. So what are your patterns? What are you noticing about your patterns? Now, earlier on, we talked about how your body feels, what happens to your body, what you notice in your body. You can put the two together. That's no problem. You can think about these traumas that have happened and these patterns, and now what is happening in terms of these unconscious behaviors. What are you noticing in that? How does your body feel? What does your body do in these patterns that you're noticing? That means the patterns are the things that you're triggered by, remember, okay? Because the trigger acts like a trauma that's happened from when you were a child. So what are you noticing here? Give this a go. It's quite interesting. And please remember, and I'm going to keep on saying this through the course, if anything comes up for you, always bring in no judgment here. Do not judge yourself for any of this. Okay, so anything comes up, do it without any judgment. Do it if you can without any, I'm not good enough, I can't do this, look at the way I am, or whatever, right? Because that is going to be that ego again, the egoic mind that's coming in that keeps on creating the blocks. Do it with complete consciousness, with awareness, but knowing that you can be compassionate towards yourself and keep bringing in that compassion for yourself. This work is not easy, it's not meant to be. So keep bringing that compassion for yourself. Don't judge yourself for any of this and just see it for what it is, that you have gone through certain life events that have affected you, right? And I've said this before, the work that I do is soul work. So the way I look at it, my perception is that actually your soul has decided these experiences in order for you to clear all this stuff for yourself, in order to clear this, in order to heal for yourself. That's actually how it works. So if you can start seeing it in that way, that could be quite helpful. Now, the next part 3 coming up, we're going to delve really deep, even deeper into how the ego actually works, what the process is, the details behind all this, how you can start seeing the ego in your life in that way. That would really help you. If you can watch that video, that would really help you understand how you can start seeing it in a, maybe a more accurate way for yourself, so you can start putting the changes into place.